Well, I see that we are at 2 o'clock. So I just want to quickly welcome all of you here, and I want to extend our special welcome and thanks to Apostle Lachlan Mckay, and I want to thank Lach for his willingness to do this. For those of you who don't know, he was supposed to be our guest minister at Narancho Reunion this year, and I still think of you, Lach, as our guest minister. Reunion is just taking a different form this year, so I'm really delighted that you've been so graceful and willing to do various things for us. This is just one thing that Lach will be doing for the CEM Mission Center this summer. He's also going to be doing a tour of Kirtland in early August, and then he'll be doing a 5-day history class during the actual week that Narancho Reunion was supposed to take place. And I'm not going to tell you what those dates are, because I'm going to encourage everyone to actually go to the CEM site and look at the calendar so you see all the dates for all the activities and join as many as you can. But Lach, thanks again so much, and I'll turn it over to you.
Well, just before he does, we got a couple of things we have to kind of take care of.
Of course. Thank you, Scott.
First of all, as Lach is moving around, there are some times when he's between buildings where he's probably going to drop out. So we ask you to have a little bit of patience while he goes through a Wi-Fi dark spot and rejoins the network. Okay, so don't disappear just because he disappears. Secondly, we do need to remind you that these sessions are going to be recorded. So if you do not want your image to be recorded, please turn off your video by clicking on your little camera icon, which should be down at the bottom left of your screen, to stop broadcasting your video. And with that, we will go to Lach.
It's a privilege and a joy to be with you today. We first started talking about giving online tours, must be 10 years ago, when a dear friend of my dad's from Australia happened to Skype him when he was visiting me. And we just carried his laptop around the site using the cell signal. And this dear friend, who was probably in her 90s by now, was just overcome with emotion. She'd always dreamed of coming to Nauvoo as a church member, and it was clear she was never going to make it in person. So it was just an amazing experience for her, and that has inspired us to work towards this for a long time. Unfortunately, the infrastructure here in Nauvoo is not particularly cooperative, so we're still working through some of those details, as was suggested. I want to start with just a little context. As most of you probably know, of course, the church was established in upstate New York in 1830. They almost immediately sent missionaries to Jackson County, Missouri. Actually, they were headed to what is now Kansas, the US state of Kansas, to preach to Native Americans. They got out there and discovered they should have stopped in St. Louis, Missouri to get a permit from the Indian agent to be there. There were other missionaries from other churches that objected. So they had to back up to Jackson County, Missouri, while they sent somebody back to St. Louis to try and get the permit. Those people didn't want to waste their time. They start preaching. So soon we have some members in Jackson County, Missouri. Those in New York had also just checking. Am I still unmuted?
Yeah, we're good.
Great. Kirtland, Ohio, Jackson County, Missouri. There's a cultural conflict in Missouri. We are mostly New Englanders. Those earlier settlers, generally from Kentucky or Virginia, that just didn't mix very well. So soon, violent conflict, we are expelled, move up to Clay County, Missouri. By 1837, our bank fails in Kirtland, Ohio. Lots of lawsuits, lots of dissent. Those people pack up and walk 600 miles to northern Missouri. And so by the first time, 1837 or so, 38, the Kirtlanders and the Missourians are together in northern Missouri, a place called Caldwell County. Soon, though, we end up in violent conflict there that ends with the extermination order, courtesy of Governor Boggs. leave the state or we will exterminate you. He didn't mean leave or we'll kill you. He meant leave or we'll forcibly remove you. But whatever he meant, there are soon people killed on both sides of that conflict. They flee to Illinois and then start making their way up the Mississippi River and establish Nauvoo, the place that I am now. I am currently in what's called the homestead, Joseph and Emma's first Nauvoo home. I'm going to flip my camera and flip it again. So that you can see other than me. So Joseph and Emma's first Nauvoo home. It was built probably 1824. The Smiths buy it, move in May of 1839. It's a 2-story, 2-room block house. So originally the room I'm standing in now, and then one room upstairs, the stairs behind that door, to a room the same size. In these 2 rooms, you had Joseph and Emma and 4 and sometimes 5 children and people who would pay to board with them. It was really crowded. And then by the fall of 1839, Joseph Smith Jr., our founder, heads to Washington, D.C. to meet with U.S. President Martin Van Buren and try and get his help in getting redress from the state of Missouri. He was trying to get the federal government to force the state of Missouri to compensate us for being illegally expelled. While he's gone, malaria is raging through Nauvoo. Emma Smith, Joseph's wife, ends up taking in as many as 12 people sick with malaria and trying to nurse them back to health. Remember, they only have 2 rooms, so she ends up moving her family into a tent in the yard to make room for the sick. They desperately need more space. They get it in 1840 when the keeping room addition goes on, short for housekeeping. You would cook here in the winter months, you'd eat here, you'd entertain here, and then 2 sleeping chambers, the room we just left and the one above. This room was probably the largest room in Nauvoo when finished because it's built so very early. So this became the center of community life here by 1840. Anything that had to happen to run the church is happening in this room. Really critical space. I want to tell you a story of an event that happened in this room in 1843. I think it's probably the happiest day of Joseph Smith Jr.'s life in Nauvoo. But to get to that story, I need to back up to Missouri for a minute. Remember I talked about Governor Boggs and that extermination order. Well, fast forward, spring of 1842, former Governor Boggs is sitting in his home in Independence, Missouri, and somebody shoots him through the window. He's hit in the head multiple times. It's one shot with multiple projectiles. He doesn't die, but he is pretty seriously hurt. The Missourians quickly start saying the Latter-day Saints did it, and Joseph Smith put him up to it, they said. They blamed a guy named Porter Rockwell for pulling the trigger. But they argued that Joseph was an accessory before the fact, so they start sending sheriffs over here to Nauvoo to try and arrest Joseph and extradite him, take him back to Missouri to face charges. Joseph had earlier been court-martialed in Missouri and sentenced to death, despite the fact that he was not in the militia. So he had pretty good reason to think he's not going to get a fair hearing in Missouri. He decides he's not going back, so he starts building hiding places into his homes. And one of them was just outside this window. You might be able to see just a little bit of a cellar door leading into the cellar underneath the room I'm standing in now. And they built hidden hinges into the wooden steps into the cellar, and they could flip those steps up, drop underneath, close the steps, and then there was a little brick vaulted room just big enough for 2 men and some food and some water, projecting off to the west underground. So pushing out to the west there. You also see through the window the summer kitchen. That is where Joseph Smith Sr. and Lucy Mack Smith lived when they first arrived. Those were the parents of Joseph Smith Jr. And we now know there was a connecting roof between the 2 structures So what you're looking at was kind of a breezeway, probably open on both ends, but again, access to the hiding place there. Joseph Smith Jr., summer and fall of 1842, spent about 80 days in hiding as sheriffs from Missouri keep coming over and trying to arrest and extradite Joseph, take him back to face charges. He's not always hiding in that little spot under the stairs. He's all over Nauvoo, staying with different friends, sometimes over in Iowa. Just he'd pop up and preach at a conference and then disappear again. But try and imagine running a city and a church under those kind of conditions. So finally, out of frustration, Joseph goes to Springfield, Illinois, Springfield, the capital of the US state of Illinois, for an extradition hearing. So the question was, are we going to send Joseph back to Missouri or not? The judge for this extradition hearing is a guy named Nathaniel Pope, and Joseph's attorney is Justin Butterfield. Butterfield, pretty talented and also pretty funny. Here is a paraphrase of his opening statement. "I never dreamed," he said, "that I would be standing in front of the Pope." Get it? Judge Pope, standing in front of the Pope, defending the prophet of the Lord in the presence of holy apostles. Some of the 12 were there, surrounded by beautiful angels. Well, the angels apparently a reference to the fact that there were ladies in the court on the bench with Judge Pope. And those ladies, it seems, included Mary Todd Lincoln, Abraham's new bride. Butterfield managed to get Joseph released. And on the way home, church leaders wrote something called the Mormon Jubilee, 14 verses long, celebrating Judge Pope and Governor Ford of Illinois and anybody else they could think of. They would sing this song at every stop on the way back. They rest for a week. The 12 apostles call for a day to be set aside in fasting and prayers of thanksgiving. So imagine the whole city of Nauvoo fasting and prayers of thanksgiving. One of the fast meetings was in the room that we're in now. And then the next day, Joseph and Emma host 75 of their closest friends here for a celebratory feast. Now, this is a big room for the 1840s, but it's not really a very big room. It took 4 seatings to get everybody fed in this room. Joseph and Emma Smith wait on the tables themselves. They sang all 14 verses of the Mormon Jubilee that you just saw. But Eliza R. Snow, one of the members, apparently thought that 14 verses didn't really capture the joy in their hearts. So she wrote another 16 verses, and they sang those as well. In the midst of that celebration, Joseph Smith Jr. announced that it was not only a celebration of his freedom, but also a celebration of his 15th wedding anniversary. It was probably only his wife Emma, though, who noticed that it was really 16 years. Big celebration in this room. I'm going to fast forward so we can have a look at a different room. By 1858, Joseph Smith III, the son of the founding prophet, was elected justice of the peace here in Nauvoo, Illinois. It's kind of a combination sheriff and judge. And by 1860, he joins with us. He joins the reorganization. And the locals were not amused. Some of them began passing resolutions forbidding Joseph III to preach or pray in their communities, which is a bit of a problem on many levels. But in that really tense environment, Joseph Smith III had to run for re-election. And you're now looking at the addition he put on the house. This is an 1858 addition, 2 rooms down, and there's another 2 bedrooms up. Joseph III had to run for re-election. He wins in what he calls a landslide. And he said that he won because by the early 1860s, almost everybody in Nauvoo is an immigrant of some kind, mostly Germanic peoples. And Joseph III said that he believed that they were being taken advantage of because of their lack of familiarity with our language and customs. So to try and protect them, he would often do their legal work for free. And as a way of expressing their thanks, they turn out and vote for him en masse, despite what their religious and business and political leaders are telling them to do. So a little bit of insight into Joseph Smith III. Again, we're in his 1858 addition to the house. And then by 1866, he moved to Plano, Illinois, just outside of Chicago. I want to pause for questions. We're going to try and see if you can just unmute yourself and ask. And if that doesn't work very well, we might switch to the chat feature. But let's start. Anybody have any questions so far?
Did anyone own the house before the Smiths?
Yeah, who owned the house before the Smiths? The Smiths bought it from Hugh White, and it was probably built by his dad, Captain James White, in about 1824. They were river people, meaning worked on what was called lightering. So Nauvoo is on the Des Moines Rapids, or was before they were submerged, one of two places on the Mississippi that steamboats often couldn't get by. So they would unload cargo about 12 miles downstream at Keokuk, Iowa, put it on these little boats, attach those little boats to a team of animals who would walk in the shallow waters on the Iowa shore and pull the lighters, those little boats filled with cargo, upriver 12 miles to deep water again. And hopefully the lightened steamboat could get over the rapids, or maybe not, maybe they had to have another boat. They'd load the cargo back up and keep going. So the Whites worked in that industry. But we also know that as early as maybe 1804, Dennis Julien, who we think was a French fur trader, was here with a trading post very close to this spot. So of course there were Native Americans here for thousands of years, but European settlers by just after 1800. Other questions?
Where did the name Nauvoo come from?
Where did the name Nauvoo come from? It's highly likely that Joseph Smith Jr. learned it from a man named Joshua Satius, who we hired to teach us Hebrew in Kirtland, Ohio, in the Kirtland Temple. Satius, his family worshiped in what is now the oldest synagogue in the U.S. in Newport, Rhode Island, the Toro Synagogue. And he was a very talented Hebrew instructor. He published his own textbooks, copies of which have survived. And in one of those, on page 111 in the back of the book, a list of obscure and anomalous forms found in the Hebrew Bible, the word Nauvoo carrying with it connotations of beautiful. So I think it's a reference to beautiful mountains. So almost certainly Joseph learned it from Joshua Satius. Beautiful, connotations of beautiful is what it means. Other questions?
When they kept putting those new rooms on, how did it work with the roof? Because if they put added a room on in a building to an existing one, the roof would end at the original building. So how did they work all that?
So we'll have a chance to look at it a little later if you'll remind me to turn the camera around. But what they did is the addition you're looking into now was only a story or a story and a half. So they attached a shorter building to a taller building with a completely separate roof structure on the shorter building. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah. Okay.
And then with the 1858 Joseph Smith III edition, it is 2 stories tall, just like the original blockhouse or log cabin. And so they just extended the roof, and it's all basically one roof structure for the 2-story part. And even after the 1840 edition was put on, again, back through that doorway, they sided the logs. They put wood siding over the logs. So you didn't know the prophet lived in a log cabin after 1840. And of course, the 1858 edition was also sided. So it looks like it's all one structure by 1858, but it's 3 separate pieces tied together. Other questions? So it's getting really crowded for the Smiths. Joseph said it was not uncommon for his own family to go to bed without supper because they had given all their food away. You have soon thousands of English converts arriving in Nauvoo. And the first thing they often do is come here to the homestead to meet their prophet for the first time. And they were often deeply impoverished. So the Smiths did what they could, but were being overwhelmed. They had a plan. The plan is to build a massive brick hotel. We're going to step out and see it, called the Nauvoo House. You see the brick structure there. That's only a small portion of it. You see a little stone building to its left and a stone wall connecting the two. So that was one wing of two wings. It was going to be an L-shaped structure. Imagine another wing pushing off to the east, so away from us, where that brick structure is. So the plan is 4.5 stories tall. One of stone, you see part of it there, and then 4 or 3.5, 4 of brick. They worked on it really hard in Joseph's lifetime, but never got beyond the stone foundation. They understood, though, that the Lord had commanded them to build this building. So even after Joseph's death, under the direction of Brigham Young, they put more than 270 men to work on the building. And in just a month or so, they got another story put up, maybe even a story and a half. They then ran into problems with neighbors. They had to give up. They start leaving Nauvoo by February of 46. But even then, they leave agents behind who continue to try and get that building built. They are not given up easily. But finally, they do have to give up. So it's 2.5 stories tall, no roof, no floors. That whole footprint, and most of it missing now, but that whole footprint was there. Emma Smith's second husband. So Emma had remarried in 1847, marries a man named Lewis Bidem. And in the 1860s, he starts taking brick and stone from the wings, putting some of it on top of the 1840s southwest corner. And he creates the brick building you see now, again called the Riverside Mansion, when Emma and Lewis lived there. So Emma Hale Smith Bidem and lives out the last 8 years of her life in that building and dies in that building in 1879. I'm going to slowly pan around and you will see the Mississippi. It looks like it's out there a couple hundred yards, but the river actually starts just beyond that brown picket fence that you can see. But it is silted in pretty drastically because of the dam that goes in downriver in 1913. But the homestead right on the river, you see the foot of Main Street here in front of the Nauvoo House, and that street, Main Street, begins and ends on the Mississippi because Nauvoo is a peninsula with the river on 3 sides of us. So we are on the south, but that street runs north-south, runs north, and runs into the Mississippi again. We're gonna have a look at the Smith family cemetery. So you see the graves of Joseph, Hiram, Emma Smith. So Joseph and Hiram are killed, of course, June 27 of 44. They're initially buried secretly where that little stone building we saw earlier is, across the street. But after a period of months, they're moved even more secretly to under what was sometimes called the bee house. That's the log structure you see a reconstruction of. Emma Smith would later tell her children, who would later tell their children, that the graves are not far off the corner of the homestead, underneath a little outbuilding. But after many decades, all the outbuildings are long gone. So the family knows that they're buried here, but they don't know exactly where. As I mentioned, the river is dammed in 1913. The water starts rising, they start to panic, and they end up commissioning a search. Frederick Madison Smith does that. So imagine 2 men bailing as 1 man digs right down at the river's edge, just on the other side of that fence. It's January 1928, so pretty cold here. They don't find anything, so they are digging trenches across the hillside there, hoping to hit the footings of a little building. And in doing that, they accidentally find the grave of Emma Smith. She was buried between that log building and where the stone structure is now. And then a couple days later, they find Joseph and Hiram, where the little log building is. They rebury all 3 where you see them today. So Emma, Joseph, Hiram Smith's grave. It's also the Smith family cemetery, so a total of maybe 24 family members and friends scattered across the grassy slope in front of you. Questions on the Smith family cemetery or anything else? All right. So as I mentioned, it was getting really crowded for the Smiths. It was also getting pretty expensive. The plan was that big Nauvoo house, that big fancy brick building under construction, but it is moving very slow, very, very slow. So the Smiths decide that they're going to build a smaller structure across the street. And as it's being built, somebody says, well, you know, that Nauvoo house, that brick building is not going to be done anytime soon. Why don't you just slap some hotel rooms on the back of your house? And the Smiths do. So you're going to see across the street a white structure and a white picket fence stretching out behind it. So that white structure is the 1842 home, and the white picket fence goes back about as far as the hotel addition on the house. So this 1843 addition, 10 rooms, and the Smiths become innkeepers when they move over there and open for business by September of 1843. Our next stop is going to be going over to have a look at the mansion. Just take note of the well before we go. That well was here when the Smiths arrived, but it wasn't very deep and the water wasn't very good. So they are blasting to deepen it. Little Joseph Smith III is on the other side of the door just behind me. He's a little too interested in the process. There's a big explosion. He steps out to survey the damage. The debris is still in the air. Imagine a 15 or 20 pound rock coming down and landing at his feet. It brushes the brim of his hat on the way past. I often ponder, what if he had been a step faster? What would that mean for us? Well, I wouldn't be here. Joseph III is my great-great-grandfather, so I wouldn't be here. There would be no Community of Christ, no reorganization. There would be no Graceland University. There would be no congregations where many of you attend, and some of you met your spouses or your parents met spouses. So I sometimes get lost in thinking about the profound effect something as simple as one step can make on future generations. You see a brown picket fence in front of me as well. One morning, word reached Nauvoo that a church family had lost their home outside of town. There'd been a house fire. And a bunch of the church leaders are standing around by that fence talking about how sad it is and how sorry they are for the family and what a tragedy it is. Joseph Smith Jr. walks by and listens for a minute. Then he reaches into his pocket and pulls out a $5 gold piece. And he says, "Brethren, I feel $5 sorry for this family. How sorry are you?" I love it. Not good enough to think right thoughts, orthodoxy. It has to lead to right practice, orthopraxy. Joseph believed that we needed to be actively engaged in being the hands and feet of Jesus in the world today. Questions before we head across the street? Am I still with you?
Yes.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
I'm going to turn my camera off to try and prevent a drop, and I'll move as quick as I can. But if you do come up with questions, feel free to ask as I move across the street.
Don't forget to show us the roof.
Oh yeah, let me do that. We'll see if my signal holds. Thank you for the reminder. That help?
Yeah, that's good.
All right. So camera off, and I'll see you across the street, but I'm happy to answer questions as I go. All right. Did I keep you? Kind of?
Yep.
Yes, sir.
All right, Joseph and Emma's mansion house. So first room on your left as you walk in, the ladies' parlor, the fanciest room in the house. This is where the Smiths would hope to entertain their most important visitors. On one occasion, Joseph took a meal in this room and he ate too much and he blamed Emma. You see Joseph and Emma in the portraits there. He blamed Emma for letting him overeat. W.W. Phelps, one of the church leaders, said to Joseph, well, Joseph, you should do as Napoleon did. Just eat at a small table, big enough for you and one plate of food, and that way you can't eat too much. Emma laughed and said, oh, Brother Phelps, you don't know Mr. Smith as I. He could never eat a meal without friends at the table. On the south side of the hallway, you see the bar room or the office. This is where the gentlemen would gather. This is where you would come if you were staying at the hotel. They had a guest registry book you'd sign and then go upstairs. We have an account of Joseph sitting on the carpet in this room pulling sticks with the Nauvoo police. Stick pulling was a game of strength. You would pull up the other person up and over the top of you as the goal. This particular account said that Joseph could pull up even the stoutest of the Nauvoo policemen with one hand. Joseph apparently pretty good at this game. Well, I'm not sure if that tells us more about Joseph or about the police. I'm going to show you some Sutcliffe Maudsley profiles. These are copies, but the original's done in Nauvoo in the 1840s. Joseph Smith Jr. in his lieutenant general's uniform, part of the Nauvoo Legion or state militia. Emma in her horseback riding habit. Joseph was running for United States president in the spring of 1844. So you see some of his presidential platform. The General Smith's Views is the name of this little booklet. On one occasion, Joseph brought home unexpectedly for dinner several politicians, and Emma had to quickly pull together dinner and dessert. For dessert, she fried dough and served it with honey. One of the visitors said, Mrs. Smith, this is delicious. What do you call it? A candidate, she said. A candidate. Why, yes, because it's all puffed up and full of hot air. That was the grandchildren's favorite story about their grandmother. They would tell that over and over and over again. We're going to climb the stairs to the second floor. And go into Joseph and Emma's first bedroom in this mansion house, this second home. I mentioned a hiding place across the street. Well, this house had a hiding place built in as well. It was called the secret closet. So imagine a piece of wood running across, hiding that seam, had clothes pegs sticking out so you could hang your clothes on it. But if you knew what to do, you could pull out one of the pegs that released a hidden hinge and the board would flip up, exposing a seam in the wall. You swing it open. You'll see a ladder leading up through a scuttle, which you can't really see, but into the attic. And so they laid planks over the ceiling joists above for a place for Joseph to sit quietly. So this is another of his hiding places. This one actually survives. I don't think he ever had to use it because the attempts by Missouri to arrest and extradite Joseph to take him back to Missouri are behind them at this point in time, but it would be comforting to know it was here just in case. There's another beautiful room just across the hallway, probably initially the children's room, maybe Joseph's mom, Lucy Mack Smith here. But soon the Smiths realized that innkeeping, hotel keeping, is not the best use of their time. And they lease these rooms as well as the whole hotel addition to a man named Ebenezer Robinson. And when they do that, the Smiths have to give up these rooms and they move into what had been the servants' quarters you see here. And they put their children in what had been a storeroom, 3 and sometimes 4 Smith boys in this little room. And their daughter, Julia, probably in the back of the house, was taking care of her grandmother, Lucy Mack Smith. You see a chest of drawers Emma purchased in this home for in St. Louis for this home. So that's a Smith piece of furniture. And then you see a rail and style chest going the wrong way. This is probably 1660s English. Has a false bottom in it. It's going to have a hidden compartment underneath it. And that is traditionally where Emma Smith hid the manuscripts that would later become the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible, or sometimes called the inspired version of the Bible. Emma believed that as long as she was protecting those papers, she and her home were protected. We're going to head back downstairs. Doing my best not to make anybody seasick. This room was a porch in the 1840s, but it has a nice model of what was here. So the front of the house, still here, kind of from this left, that's 1842, Smiths move in the fall of 43. And then the hotel addition is this huge structure to the back. As the model illustrates, there was a big room just under here, under the hotel rooms. This is all now gone, demolished in 1890. But that big room was the hotel dining room, and that's where Joseph and Emma entertained large groups of friends. They spent their last Christmas together there, hosting 50 couples for singing and dancing and eating. A not so happy time there, 6 months later, the public viewing for Joseph and Hiram Smith. Imagine about 10,000 people in one day coming through the front door, through this little porch, through a wall, through a door buried still in the wall here into that dining room to pay their final respects. 10,000 people in one day for the public viewing of Joseph and Hiram Smith. The last room we'll see in the mansion is Emma's kitchen. Once the hotel lease is in place, though, the Smiths don't need their own kitchen anymore. So this room becomes a private sitting parlor for the family. As part of the lease agreement, Joseph and Emma got to take their meals from the hotel dining room, again, stretching off behind that fireplace, but now gone. So this becomes a private sitting room for the family after January of 44. You see these green chairs at the table. I believe these to be original to the home, so Smith objects, as is the little high chair you see, another Smith piece. My mom sat in that one as a baby. Questions on the mansion?
How are these buildings lit at nighttime? Like, what was it? Just like candles, or what did they use for light at night?
Yeah, most of what they did here for light would have been candles, but they did have other fuel sources. Whale oil was one, but it was pretty expensive. But whale oil lamps would have been the best way to go if you could afford it. They also had little tiny lamps, and I'm going to get it wrong, but they burned some kind of a camphene mixture. There's a couple of examples of what are sometimes called sparking lamps. They're called sparking lamps, and just for scale, there's my hand. So these are tiny little lamps. They're tiny because the fuel in them was really volatile. And if you dropped it, you were in big trouble. So they were trying to minimize the destruction if you dropped one of these. And as the fuel burned, they would throw off little sparks, just little pops. So sparking lamps, and in the US anyway, that's what results in sparking becoming slang for kissing. The story is, and I've found at least one example of this in a historical text, that if a young man was courting a young woman, and the young woman's father liked the young man, he would put more fuel in the lamp and tell him he could stay till the lamp went out. If he didn't like him, he would put less fuel in the lamp. So they controlled how long the couple could sit together with these sparking lamps. Again, eventually becomes slang for kissing. Other questions?
How much of this facility has had to be restored, or is it all
How much
pretty
has been
original?
restored? So restoration is kind of ongoing, but the structures that we have been in so far, the homestead and the mansion house, are both original buildings. The mansion in the 1990s, we did a lot of work on. We had to lift it up and put a foundation under it, and better heating and air conditioning systems, things like that. But they did survive. And so we haven't talked about this yet, but Nauvoo grew to about 11,500 people in the 1840s, second in size in Illinois, the state of Illinois, only to Chicago at the time. So it was this booming city. But after the Exodus, after most people left, you have houses for almost 12,000 people, but only maybe 1,200 to live in them originally. And maybe that grew again to perhaps 3,000 before shrinking again. Today we're at 1,100. So what that means is many, many, many houses from the 1840s did not survive. And Nauvoo becomes Western Illinois' Home Depot or building center, meaning people would come here and pay for the privilege of taking buildings down so they could reuse the building materials elsewhere. Fortunately, the Smiths' properties survived because they stayed and continued to live in them. And if the house is occupied, it's probably going to make it. Now, even then, the back half of this house was torn down in 1890 because David Hiram Smith, one of Joseph and Emma's sons, had inherited it, and he was emotionally disabled and institutionalized for decades and unable to care for his part of the house. And the red brick store, which is going to be our next stop, our last stop, also was torn down in 1890. But we are really fortunate that a number of the Smith properties survived. Other questions? So we're now gonna head to the red brick store, which you can just see in the distance down there, some bricks through the trees. I am going to turn my camera off again, but I'm gonna talk as I walk and tell you a little bit about community building in early Nauvoo and kind of their plans here. So we'll see if we are able to hold the signal. If I disconnect, I'll join you again. We'll also see a towboat headed down the Mississippi if we make it fast enough. So I'll actually wonder if I can zoom in. No. Can you make out a tow there through the trees? Just behind that car now.
I cannot
Yeah, I
see
can
it.
see it.
And you're seeing the barges and then the towboat, which pushes the collection of barges, which are called a tow collectively, coming into view. All right, I'm going to turn off my camera, but I'll keep talking. So Nauvoo, when the Latter-day Saints arrived, was described as covered with trees and bushes and so wet that a man on foot could barely make it through. I assumed their water problems were courtesy of the Mississippi. They were not. The problem was springs and runoff and the river bluffs above us. And that water would run down here onto the flats and would not drain. So their solution was to get out their shovels and start digging. They put in a drainage ditch in some places 10 feet deep, all the way to bedrock. It's still here, and it diverts that water from above into the Mississippi. That allowed them to start surveying as the flats dry out, and they end up implementing a system with 4-acre city blocks. Each 4-acre block is going to have 4 1-acre lots. Each family buys an acre, builds a house, plants a garden, chickens, milk cows, fruit trees. It's a beautiful plan, soon overwhelmed by their missionary success. Thousands of new members moving in, many from the British Isles. So a 4-acre block, supposed to be the home of 4 families, is subdivided. In one case, becomes 14 lots. So imagine Nauvoo flats covered with 1,200 log cabins, 300 to 500 timber frame homes, 200 to 300 brick homes, Boston City. Another view of the river and the towboat and the privy.
Very important.
Yeah. So I basically was wrapping up about that time, but it really was truly a city. Joseph Smith said that he enjoyed escaping to his office upstairs here in the Red Brick store to get away from the chaos of the city. Which it doesn't feel very chaotic today. Pretty quiet, even more so now, of course, with the pandemic. So this is a reconstruction of Joseph Smith's Red Brick store. Originally opened for business January of 1842 with Joseph himself downstairs here behind the counter on opening day. He wrote a letter to a friend that day and said, "I love to wait upon the saints and to be a servant to all." He also loved to give his followers credit even if they couldn't pay him back. He chose people over product, which is a great idea for the profit of the church, but a problem for a storekeeper who needs to generate a profit. So fairly quickly, Joseph leased the store to other people, starting with a man named Willard Richards. But some church functions stayed here. For example, in this little office became the counting office for the church. You would pay your tithing here, and this is also where a man named Willard Richards worked on the church history. You see this little desk to the left, the smaller of the two desks. That was a gift from N.K. Whitney, a bishop of the church, to Joseph Smith III, just before Bishop Whitney headed across the plains to Utah. And Joseph III remembered that gift, saying that Whitney said to him, "I want you to remember that the pen is mightier than the sword. I'm going to give you my writing desk." While others were giving Joseph III gifts like pistols and Bowie knives, Whitney wanted to instill in Joseph III a spirit of peace rather than one of violence by giving him his desk, the original back with us today. We're going to go up the stairs. So the second story here, once finished, became the biggest room in Nauvoo until the temple opens, and it became the center of community life. So all kinds of important stuff up here. Things like school for the children, art exhibits, magic shows, rope walking exhibitions, some really important stuff too, though, not just day-to-day. Was in this room that something called the Female Relief Society of Nauvoo was organized. It's a women's organization with Emma Smith as first president. They would find jobs for the widows and food for the poor. It was also here that endowment rituals, meaning the rituals that the members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints today, the foundations of those introduced in this room. It's also here things like Joseph III's succession blessing, where Joseph Smith Jr. blessed his son to lead the church someday. They even had the political in this room to be their candidate for United States president. As you saw earlier, his presidential platform survives. It's called General Smith's Views. And in that little presidential platform, Joseph lays out what he's going to do for folks here if elected. Among other things, he is going to be rid of slavery by 1850 or sooner. He's going to slash the number of elected officials in Washington, D.C., and slash the salaries of those that remain. He said, I will pay them $2 a day. That's more than a farmer makes, and a farmer works an honest day. Joseph was going to throw open prison doors, tell the prisoners to go and sin no more. and then turn those prisons into centers of education. You might be getting a sense as to why he was controversial, and some historians argue that Joseph Smith Jr.'s death in Carthage, Illinois, June 27 of 44, where he was murdered. Some argue his death was at least a statewide political conspiracy. I'm not completely convinced, but it is.
Okay, Locke, we've lost
Which even today carries political overtones. Start to lose you?
Yeah, we're getting you back now, though.
Great. We'll head back closer to the modem. By the 1860s, the Smith family's Olive branch, an early church congregation, was meeting upstairs. By 1890, the building had fallen into disrepair and was torn down. We put it back up as part of our celebration of the 150th birthday, opened by 1980. We've covered a lot of ground in a hurry. Questions on things we've talked about or things we haven't?
You mentioned that the first house in one of the outside buildings was the residence of Joseph Smith Sr. Did he stay in that building, or did he also relocate?
Joseph Smith Sr. and Lucy Mack Smith relocated just across the street into a double log cabin. And that was where Joseph Smith Sr. died in 1840. And he and Lucy, who died in 1856, are in the Smith family cemetery, not far from where we saw the stone for their son earlier.
So when you go there now, you get the sense that this is kind of on the edge of what would have been the city. Is that true, or would it have been in the middle of everything else that was going on?
Yeah, today, this feels like the periphery of Nauvoo. But in the 1840s was the center. Now, the intersection of Main, we walked across.
Locke,
That was the place to be.
audio. Your signal.
Any better? A little better?
You're still in the red.
I'm not sure I can do much better than this.
That is better.
Okay. Intersection of Main and Water was the place to be. And one of Nauvoo's steamboat landings was just there between the homestead and the Nauvoo House. Having said that, once the church made the decision to build the temple on the hill, that starts to become a competing business district. And most of that land was owned by non-member merchants. And so there's tension between the flats and the bluff. But eventually, after Joseph's death, the bluffs won. But as a result, Mulholland Street is the main street of Nauvoo now, where all the businesses are up on the bluff. And Main Street is down on the flats with really nothing on it but historic structures. But Mulholland is not wide enough to be the main street because it wasn't intended to be. So we can't plant trees along the edges to make it cute because it's a second or third tier street in the 1840s plan. Other questions?
How many buildings does the church have in Nauvoo now compared to our LDS friends?
How many buildings do we have? We might have 20 buildings. I don't know what the LDS church has as far as buildings. I can say that we have 50 acres, and the LDS church has maybe 1,300 acres, but I wouldn't trade our 50 for their 100, meaning it is historically the most part of the city. Between the Riverside Mansion, Nauvoo House, Smith Family Cemetery, Red Brick Store, it is the heart of their 1840s community.
Okay. The other question, when you talked about Joseph building a house here and another house later on, Did he finance all that personally, or was that kind of a church project?
That's a really good question. How did Joseph pay for stuff? It's a little bit of both, probably. Joseph made a living here buying and selling the city plot, meaning he was the chief real estate developer in Nauvoo. It gets really complex. We still don't fully understand real estate in 1840s Nauvoo, but there were state laws limiting the amount of land churches could own at the time. I think it was like 20 acres. And so what the church did is use a trustee and trust to own the property. So it's in Joseph's name, but it's church property. But in other cases, it's in Joseph's name and it's Joseph's property personally. But at his death, you couldn't tell what. And that became one of the real points of conflict between Emma and Brigham Young. Emma's worried about feeding her children. Brigham Young is worried about feeding people as they cross the plains. I understand both concerns, but that became a big issue. So some of it would have been donated. Some of it was probably church funds, some of it Joseph's funds. And it wasn't just Joseph that was treated that way, meaning if you were wealthy and you moved to Nauvoo, you would have been charged top dollar for a lot. But if you were poor, you might be given a piece of property or sold it very cheaply. But then you'd start talking to your neighbor and discover, what they paid versus what you paid, and it could lead to some tension. But Joseph is using real estate as an equalizer here.
Okay.
How many tourists would you say go through the Community of Christ historical sites in Nauvoo annually?
How many tourists annually? This year, none.
Really? Why?
Yeah, that's not quite true. We opened March 1 and we're open 12 days before we shut for COVID. So we are all locked down, as are the Mormons. And I can't imagine, unfortunately, that we're going to be able to open this year. Normally, we probably give tours to 20 to 25,000, but probably have close to 100,000 either in the store or the cemetery or on tours.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah. Yep.
And would most of those be LDS people on sort of pilgrimage?
Yeah, most of those are LDS people on pilgrimage, and our non-member audience grows and shrinks based on how the LDS church is using their historic sites at the time. And what I mean by that is, as they become more history focused, it becomes more comfortable for non-Latter-day Saints to visit. But as they become more missionary focused, it becomes less comfortable for non-Latter-day Saints to visit. And so you can kind of follow the trend. Right now, the LDS church is swinging back very, very significantly to history focused, less missionary focused. And so we should see an increase in non-church visitors in the next few years.
Wow, neat.
Other questions?
Was the Nauvoo temple ever completed?
Was the Nauvoo temple ever completed? It depends on your definition of complete. And I would say no, and we as a church said no, but it was kind of a silly argument. There's a Doctrine and Covenants section that says if the Nauvoo temple is not completed, it will be rejected and the church with it, and they're dead with it. And so we argued with our cousins in the Mormon church that it was never finished, and therefore the church was rejected, and that's why we had to reorganize it. What they should have argued is, well, the reason it wasn't finished is our enemies prevented it, and the Revelation says if your enemies prevent it, it's acceptable. But it just kind of became a silly argument. So outside it was done. Inside it was used on the first floor and on the third floor. The second floor was not finished. Even by the time they left, by the time it burned, not finished. But the same is true of Kirtland Temple. The second floor was not finished in Kirtland when the temple was dedicated. So no, it was not done, but it was enclosed and being used.
How big is the Nauvoo temple compared to Kirtland, just relative size?
I think I'm going to guess that it's 60% larger than Kirtland. It's a big structure.
Is there any of the Nauvoo temple left now?
Yeah, there is some of the Nauvoo temple left now. In fact, the LDS Church has a shed in Nauvoo full of stone from the temple. We have 2 moonstones and a sunstone from the temple. So these were decorative elements inspired by Freemasonic symbols, suns and moons and stars that were on engaged columns on the side of the temple. Really interesting decorative elements. So there were 30 moonstones and 30 sunstones and 30 starstones. Again, we have 2 of the moonstones. I think there are only maybe 3, maybe 4 in existence. And we have 1 sunstone, and I think there's only maybe 2, 3 in existence.
Were they destroyed by the fire or just carted off by other people?
Yes, both.
Okay.
The temple became, after it was burned, so it burned initially by an arsonist, and then the Icarians, who were French utopians, who bought a lot of our property here, the Icarians bought the temple and were rebuilding it just as it had been, and we're going to use it as a school and I think a boarding house. But while they were working on it, a storm hit and knocked some of the walls down. They were inside the structure when it came down. Imagine how terrifying that was. They weren't hurt, but it was close. So for a decade or more, all that stood was the front facade. And then it got dangerous, and so the city ended up taking it down. So it's all down by maybe 1868, 69. And the temple became a quarry. So if you needed building stone, you came and probably bought it and used it all over the area. So there's Nauvoo temple stone scattered all around us in different buildings. Germans, I mentioned Germans earlier, they brought their wine making culture with them. By 1866, Nauvoo had 425,000 grapevines in the ground here. And so Nauvoo ended up with lots and lots and lots of wine cellars here. And a lot of those are apparently built of temple stone.
Locke, in terms of what we might call spiritual experiences or the receiving and writing of revelation, of the buildings that we have in Nauvoo, is one perhaps more prominent than the others in that particular regard?
Where my revelations have been written down or received, I'd say that the homestead would be the best candidate for a number of them. I'm fighting with my gimbal at the moment, sorry about that. Homestead would be the place where a number of those would have been recorded and received perhaps. Some written in the red brick store as well. But the reality is that most revelation came in response to questions, and the questions were asked early as the church was being set up. So far more revelatory activity in Kirtland and Ohio than there was in Nauvoo.
Right, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Anything else?
Where did all of the artifacts that you've got in there now come from? Or you said some of them were authentic. Are the others just replicas, or?
Yeah, most of what we have are period objects that were acquired by Sidney Moore in the 1950s on behalf of the church. He was an antiques dealer who helped us with restorations. The real push began in 1927 when Frederick Madison Smith and his daughter Lois Smith Larson visited for a reunion here, and we had the properties open by that time, but they realized that we weren't really utilizing them the way we should, and so he put out a call, Fred put out a call for church families to begin donating objects or artifacts, and the very first donation came from the August Lee family, which was Michelle McGrath's family, for anybody who knows Michelle, who was in the presiding bishopric for a time. So some purchased, but most donated through the years. And most of our Smith objects, not all, but many of them come through the Lynn and Lorraine Smith family. So Joseph III had 17 kids, so his family objects get scattered. Alexander had 9 kids, his family objects get scattered. David Hiram Smith, the youngest child born after his dad's death, had only 1 child who had only 2 children, so their family objects stayed together. And Lynn and Lorene Smith then donated many of those to us in the early 1990s. Anything else?
I see the fire sprinklers in some of the buildings, so they're all protected now with fire sprinklers and safety devices and fire alarms.
Yep. Put in the sprinklers in the 1950s, and we have fire alarms, security alarms, etc.
Have you had any vandalism at all in the last number of years? No?
Very little vandalism, very little vandalism. The same is true in Kirtland.
I don't
At
have a
some point
question.
before we,
Go ahead.
sorry, I was just going to say, at some point before you go, you need to back up so we can see what's on your T-shirt. We can only see the front part.
Oh, Sydney Rigdon for.
Is it readable?
It is.
So
yes.
this General Joseph Smith for president, General Joseph Smith for president, Sidney Rigdon for vice. That the masthead, meaning that was the top of the church newspaper here in the 1840s as Joseph was running for US president.
How far did he get in the end?
He didn't get too far before he was killed. And I don't think, historians debate whether or not he thought he had a chance. I don't really think that he thought he was going to win. I think, he wrote to various candidates after Van Buren wouldn't help in 39. As in the run-up for the 1844 election, Joseph is writing to various candidates for US president and saying, okay, if elected, how are you going to help my people? And if they even bother to respond, it's, oh, sorry, we can't get involved because of states' rights. At the time, states were far more powerful than the federal government in the US. And so Joseph is really angry, and he decides that if the politicians aren't going to help, he'll help himself. And so I think he's running simply to line up lots of support and go back to those politicians and say, okay, now I have 100,000 votes behind me. Now what are you going to do to help? Having said that, sometimes I'm not so sure. He, with God, all things are possible. And he does make statements to the effect that, gentlemen, it's not impossible that I might win. And there's a straw poll on a steamboat that's coming up the Mississippi one day. They're polling people, and Joseph wins in a landslide. Now, what usually is left out of that story is that most of the people on the steamboat were new Mormon converts from the United Kingdom. Who knows, though? I don't think Joseph.
Uh-oh. I think we
Occupant
lost
had
him.
its either. Are we done? I missed you?
You're back.
Okay. I'm glad that it dropped because I said something that could be interpreted as disparaging to our current occupant.
You mentioned a couple of times about the UK. What percentage of those 11,000 people that were in Nauvoo would have been from the UK?
Probably as many as a third of the population was from the United Kingdom. A lot of Welsh, a lot of English. So it's kind of hard to imagine all those accents that as you walked up and down the streets here. And of course, those people who were converted by Brigham Young and members of the 12 were more likely to support them. So part of the reason that they had significant support after Joseph's death is that so much of the population were from the United Kingdom. It does seem like they were often among the more impoverished and struggling really to make a go of it here. You know, a new country, don't understand they're not generally farmers. They were from the industries of Manchester. And so you land in a new country with no skills, and it was a big problem. Anything
Any other
else?
questions for Locke?
Yeah, one more. When the bank failed in Kirtland, what were the final repercussions of that back in Nauvoo later on?
I don't know that there were many repercussions in Nauvoo when the bank failed in Kirtland. I think that most of those repercussions were in Kirtland at the time, or in the 1850s when a man named Grandison Newell revives lawsuits over the bank and convinces the Ohio state legislature to pass legislation specifically so Joseph's properties in Kirtland could be sold. So I'd say that the only impact on Nauvoo was the fact that Nauvoo, with 11,500 people, had no banks, not one bank here. But that's probably as much the US banking system in shambles at the time as it is the Kirtland bank failure.
Locke, you haven't talked much about a schoolhouse. What about the children and their education?
Yeah, schoolhouses. So we actually visited one, and I think I forgot to talk about it. The room upstairs was a schoolhouse. Joseph III talks about going to school there. We would have walked past several buildings now gone where they held schools. So normally in Nauvoo, or let me say it differently, typically in Nauvoo, instead of a building devoted to a school, it was a building that was used for lots of things and rented out to a teacher who would then advertise their school. Here, Joseph III talks about going to the school upstairs, but he said Willard Richards was trying to write the church history in this office, but imagine trying to concentrate here with lots of little kids running up and down these stairs making lots of noise. So Willard got really angry when he couldn't get him to be quiet. And one morning he walked over, and he's a huge man. He stood in the middle of the stairs and he wouldn't move and wouldn't let the kids go past until they got quiet. Well, they finally quieted down. He moved, they got noisy again. So he came in early the next morning and he moved all of the tables and chairs for the school out into the yard behind the store. The school teacher showed up and moved all those tables and chairs right back up. They had to get Joseph to mediate that dispute. And Joseph found a location next door. Esquire Hawes, H-A-W-E-S, had a brick building next door, and the school moved in there. So schools held in lots of different buildings here.
What about any medical services?
There were doctors in Nauvoo, Thomsonian medicine, I think mostly herbal medicine that they practiced. I think I probably would have been more comfortable with somebody like Emma Smith caring for me, who also did a lot of herbal medicine. We have at least one of her recipes for us, a salve. But I'd say that from a medical perspective, life in Nauvoo was a little rough, and something like 17% of the people who died in Nauvoo died of malaria. It was a huge problem with the river so close and all the swampiness and all the mosquitoes. Malaria, a huge problem in 1840s Nauvoo.
Was it still considered kind of the edge of the Midwest?
So Iowa is just across the river, and it was a territory at the time. It was not yet a state, but I wouldn't call this frontier. I think to be frontier, it has to be below 6 people per square mile. So there were more people in that here. I think, probably Kansas would have been frontier, what's now Kansas, so across from Jackson County, Missouri. And once you got to the other side of Iowa, likely, or even parts of Iowa. But it was kind of rough and tumble. But I'd say it wasn't until they left here heading out and crossed the Missouri River really, where it got really wild on the other side of Iowa. So if you remember questions once we're done, I'm happy to answer by email. I just have the typical church email address, lmackay@seaofchrist.org. And I'm also looking forward to being with you for the classes and the Kirtland tour.
Yes, I'm looking forward to that as well. And I encourage everyone to make sure you join in for those other sessions. And Locke, thank you so much for, again, your willingness to do this. And Scott, thank you for being our technical host and reminding us of all of the things to be aware of and putting up the neat Locke. I guess you didn't see it, but Scott had a little picture when you were walking from building to building, so we weren't just looking at a black screen. So Scott did a great job. And Locke, thanks for all the information. This has been fascinating.
It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah,
Appreciate it.
very good.
Thank you, Locke.
Thank you.
Take
Thank
care,
you
everyone.
so much.
Thanks.
This is wonderful.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Can't wait to come down and see it in person one day.
Please,
Oh.
please, please.
It's wonderful.
I have never been to Nauvoo. I don't know how.
Yeah, yeah.
Got to fix that.
Yes.
Don't forget
One day.
Carthage as well.
Yep.
It's amazing. Bye, everybody.
Thank
Take
you.
care,
Bye.
folks.
Bye.
Thank you.
Stay safe.
Bye-bye.